divine light, stained glass and the church. In this series, we will take a look at the process and history of making stained glass and the spiritual connection to the church. In this segment, we'll learn a bit about how stained glass is made and about those who have made it.
A single pane of glass can be strong, but with a scratch it can be broken. To cut glass, you must first score it. This wheeled tool scratches the glass and creates a V-shaped groove that allows it to break with a bit of gentle pressure. Pressing on glass creates stress lines within it. Typically, these stress lines run parallel to the surface and parallel to each other. When it's scored, the V shape changes the direction of the stress lines at the point where you've marked it, and it brings them closer and they more concentrated, allowing them to break. Even though glass has become, to all intents and purposes, very hard and rigid, so rigid that it is brittle at the molecular level, glass is still a liquid because the molecules are in a highly disordered, non-crystalline state. Glass is a supercooled liquid, so by realigning the molecular stress points with the wheel, the glass breaks. It's not exactly cutting.
I think this is an interesting metaphor for our lives. Our lives are fluid, but with the right wrong amount of stress, we can break. We often are scarred or scored by the things in our lives. It is at those places and moments that we are formed. We can allow God to mark us in good ways also. Like a piece of glass, it can break if I drop it or hit it into any jagged form. But if it is first marked in the form the artist chooses, then the pressure guides the line and turns it into something beautiful. Our faith scores us and makes us, slowly shaping us into a final work. In 2 Corinthians chapters 3, verse 18, we read, "But we all, with our face beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord." While this is a verse that speaks more specifically to mirrored glass, the message is the same. We become changed by the glory into glory. Romans 12:2 tells us, "Do not conform to the patterns of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his pleasing and perfect will. Then you will know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect." So if we allow God to form us, we learn how to do his will. If we follow those things that we've learned, those markings that he leaves for us, rather than following the natural forms where we might shatter on our own. Isaiah compared God's work in our lives to a potter. In chapter 64, verse 8, he says, "But now, O Lord, you are our Father, and we are the clay, and you who are the potter, we are formed by your hand." I think that this can apply to many forms of artistry, including glass. God is an artist, and like a potter, or a sculptor, or a glass worker, the process to make something beautiful often comes from fire, from breakage, from making marks. But if we allow those marks to come from God, we can trust that something amazing will come out of us. So once we have our piece of glass cut, and here I have a nice red, it must be secured into its form. For example, I have this lamp that my grandfather made using similar pieces of glass. Once he made them, they had to be put together somehow, and modern day small pieces can be secured together by first putting on some adhesive copper tape that is then soldered together using some chemicals that you put on before the soldering process that holds them together. For larger projects like windows or this lamp, you would use lead, which has a groove inside it, and that holds the glass. Larger windows might need some support bars, or can even be held together with some sorts of molded concrete. Modern glass is often more tempered, with things added into it and has been gone through different processes to help keep it from breaking these days. If you think of certain cookware that has been made to withstand intense heats and cool temperatures within cooking, traditional glass like this is not that way. It moves when it's heated and cooled. Those molecules either go in and contract, or they expand. So you can't have too rigid of a form with a window, or it can cause cracks and breaks. And this is especially the case with antique glass. The glass used at Lakewood Presbyterian Church is antique glass. It's called antique not because it is old, but because it is made using the same method that has been used since the Middle Ages. The glass is mouth blown and then formed into sheets, allowing more bubbles in the glass to create more light refraction. Most of the glass in our windows were imported from companies in France and Germany and use the mosaic method to change from color to color, meaning that as the picture changes, unlike with mixing paints where you can gradually change colors, you would have to change a different piece of glass to achieve that color effect. Some types of windows also are painted to allow for smaller details in imagery. Our Jesus window here, for example, with the Phoenix, as well as some of our others, use some painting on them to get the faces, instead of using just the lead and the glass lines to create the pattern and imagery. So that allows you to have things like a face inside of the head form instead of having little marks where they would connect to each other. So it allows for more of a cohesive product.
The window in the balcony of LPC comes from a different company, Blanco Glass of Milton, West Virginia. This very small little glass blowing factory is the only company in the United States that produces mouth-blown sheet glass in a production house. It is one of only 2 companies in the United States that makes the 1-inch thick dalle de verre glass used in cathedrals in famous buildings around the world. Its glass has been used in buildings such as the Harkness Library at Yale, in the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio, and in other projects in Europe and Australia and other countries within the world. I'm fortunate to have visited this little production house. It is in the town where I was born, in the Milton, West Virginia. My dad was pastor of the church in Milton, and its glass windows were also from Blanco. My parents knew the owners at the time, and in addition to their architectural glass that was used in projects such as this lamp that my grandfather made with their architectural glass, they also have tableware.
The glass in our church's balcony is made of cast glass, chipped and cut to fit the artist's design, and laid out into large frames set in concrete. It is faceted rather than simply scored and cut. This helps to allow for the most amount of light refraction. We'll discuss some of the meaning behind the colors and the imagery in another segment, and discuss the meaning of all the symbols within our windows. But today we're going to mostly focus on the construction of glass and the importance behind its usage. It's commonly suggested that stained glass windows are all about their image, or simply just as a way to beautify the church and the building. They can contain symbols of patrons, parishioners. They can be seen as a visual Bible to some. And while all of this is true, and we will discuss the impact of images within mostly non-literate societies, medieval glass workers found meaning in more than just the images within the glass. Builders, scientists, scholars, and artists were less separated in medieval culture than in today's society. Jobs were less specialized, and members of different trades often were exposed to each other. Jobs weren't quite as categorized like ours. A doctor might also be someone who works in the arts. If you think of someone like Da Vinci, that was the case. He worked both to discover certain things about the human body and medicine, as well as to develop art and mechanics. This is true for builders and for all of those who were working in the churches too. They had multiple jobs sometimes, or sometimes those fields just interconnected at the very earliest points of their study. Many builders were known to attend public lectures, hear sermons, attend school, and associate with scholars and other scholastic circles. So the physical church became a representation of the spiritual church. And for the medieval mind, objects had no meaning of their own. It wasn't how we pick an object and we decide that this means something that's special to us. It wasn't at all in that way. The physical was merely a manifestation and symbol of the spiritual world. Everything in the physical world was meant to mirror and become like heaven, or the realm of God's kingdom. The medieval artist was very concerned with the idea of illuminating a truth that transcended human existence and was made transparent within the world. And so this isn't what we normally think of when we think of Dark Age builders legging around the stones of the big cathedrals. And perhaps some of the skilled labor, it wasn't. But for those who were designing and creating these churches, there is a meaning in everything in all of those European buildings, whether it be the direction that certain things are pointed, or the thickness of the walls, or the nave, or the glass that's inside it. All of them were there for a reason. And many of the stained glass workers that created Europe's cathedrals, including Notre Dame, Chartres, Saint-Chapelle, they were known to subscribe to these ideas through their writings and the writings of those who helped to plan the buildings.
The medieval society was concerned largely with the idea of clarity and a fascination with light. Notre Dame at Chartres was built between 1149 and 1510, when you count all of the different stoppages in building and time that it took to raise funds for it. It is one of the earliest cathedrals that begins to emphasize stained glass. Chartres utilizes a significance of light in faith through its stained glass. The builders of Chartres believed that God modeled the cosmos according to a specific order, and Chartres was built to mirror the structure that God had set forth. And you can see this depicted in a lot of other ways that it was built, with certain proportions of the walls and how tall it is in all of the structures. But we can definitely see it within the glass as well. God was depicted as a builder who set up the cosmos and the kingdom of heaven. The Gothic cathedral was the kingdom of heaven on earth. So walls became thin and appeared to be made of glass, cut through with beautiful lattice work. The earlier Romanesque churches were considered more fortresses for the faithful. They had very thick walls, much smaller windows, and they would keep the light out. They were more austere and uninviting. There was a separation between what was holy and the unpure common people. But the walls of Chartres were no longer as solid. They became thin and less severe. So in a time when illiteracy was abundant, the Gothic Church started to make many changes from the closed Romanesque cathedrals. We often like to think of the Renaissance as a time when humanism started to open up the doors to the common people, but really we start to see it within the Gothic Church. The cathedral opened up its doors to a new way of that the public could find a more transparent faith. So they would show people who didn't necessarily have access to the scriptures ways to understand the faith just with the beauty around them. Light defined beauty and became a reflection of truth originating from God.
Before a gem is judged by the quality of its light, as I said with faceted windows, the amount of light that can pass through it elevates the value. Chartres was considered to be the gem amongst the cathedrals for the same reason. The ratio of glass to stone in this cathedral creates a look of a wall of glass, a curtain of glass, letting light pass through the stone, which seemed to set the interior ablaze with color. Sitting in the sanctuary of LPC, I think that we can capture a bit of what it might have felt like in some of those medieval churches before the electric light, just as the church windows were starting to become enlarged so that people had more light within the church. Seeing the colors dancing on the walls and kind of becoming a part of the windows was a magical and spiritual experience. And I think that we can gaze in awe a little bit within our own sanctuary in the same way that they did.
The projections of light flowing through the transparent glass created the effect of walls of floating color. Though the lattice-like triforium of the interior does not quite create a solid wall, the light fills in the gaps and creates this cohesive interior. This method of permeating the walls with light helped to distinguish what became the Gothic style. Light is a symbol of good and goes beyond just the quality of illumination. There are many references to light in Scripture. Jesus being the light of the world and a light in the darkness of sin. Those are common motifs throughout Christianity. In the medieval mind, light was a holy entity that was from God. It was not material, but was a natural occurrence that caused growth and brought things closer to a pure form. It was something that could somehow go through glass, like a spirit could go through something and penetrate the walls and shine on us and shine within us. And so it became an idea of the Holy Spirit as well. The abbot of another famous cathedral, Saint-Denis, who shared the same builders and philosophies as Chartres, was Abbot Suger. He describes a physical brightness, being able to bring spiritual illumination to the mind. Abbot Suger was one of the first to really start ornamenting his churches with jewels and glass and all of these things and really beautifying the interiors of the medieval church. He thought that by doing that, he was showing respect and adoration to God, but also bringing a bit of that heaven to earth in, again, what was considered God's kingdom on earth, which was the church. So, with his renovations of Saint-Denis, influenced many of the other cathedrals of his time, including Chartres and even later Notre Dame, and they went even further up into the flamboyant churches eventually. Suger was familiar with the writings of a follower of St. Paul named Dionysius, or Denis, which is who the church is referencing. Dionysius considered radiant light to be a physical manifestation of God himself. As light penetrated the colored windows, images came alive with the Spirit of God and allowed the viewer to participate in this spectacle. It was considered sort of, if you think the 3D of the time, this would have been in an era before electricity, before lights, and movies and things like that. This was miraculous to people who came and saw these sights for the first time and saw the light projected onto the walls across the room and didn't quite have an understanding of why that was at the time. The only explanation really was that light and God were inexplicably connected. And just in the same way that light could transform the interior of the church through those windows, God could transform us if we allowed the Spirit to flow through us.
I hope that you've enjoyed this first segment of Divine Light. Join me for our next segment, where we will continue to discuss the history of Gothic thought and discuss more the color and imagery used in medieval glass. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me at the email below, or find more of our studies at lakewoodpresbyterian.org. Thank you.